Hi, this is Cynthia at Pretty Paper Blackbirds. In today's video, I'll show you how to create a versatile watercolor panel that you can use to create flowers and leaves with a beautiful watercolor look. Here's a quick look at the supplies that I'm using for my panel. I have a sheet of watercolor paper. This is a 140-pound cold press. And I have this watercolor palette that I created from tube paints from Holbein. You can use any watercolor palette that you have on hand. Anything will work. I'm going to start by activating my paints, just adding a little bit of water to each of the wells, and then I will start mixing up my first color. This is going to be a soft rose color, so I'm going to mix vermilion hue, compose blue, crimson lake, and a little bit of Chinese white. And I'm just going to play around with this color mix until I have a color that looks similar to Victorian velvet. This is my absolute favorite distress color. You can create any color for this panel. It's really fun to play around with color mixing and create various colors for the flowers. Once I have a color that I like, I'm going to pull out a little bit of this color to another area on my palette, and then I'm going to add lots and lots of water to this second area. This creates transparency in the paint. It reduces the saturation of the pigment in the paint, so the paint actually appears lighter when you apply it to paper. And this is going to be my base color for the panel. I'll start by wetting the panel. I'm using a large 3/4 inch flat brush for this, and I'm just laying down a layer of water. I don't want the paper to be sopping wet. I don't want it to have standing puddles of water. You should see just a nice sheen on the paper. In order for the colors to blend well on the panel, it's really important that the paper is wet throughout this process. So you want to work fairly quickly, and this is not difficult because this process is very, very simple. So I'm starting by randomly applying my light color, that thin color, to the paper, and I'm applying the paint randomly. I'm just taking care to leave some light space for contrast. And once I have nice coverage with this first light color, I'll start to apply my darker color. Again, I'm applying randomly, but I'm taking care to leave those light and medium tones on my panel. So this gives really great contrast for the petals on the flower. Okay, I have my mid-tone down. Now I'm going to go back to my palette and I'm going to add a little bit more of the Crimson Lake to this mid-tone that I've already mixed up. And I'm going to darken this just a little bit to create a darker tone for the panel. I'm also going to add just a little bit of burnt sienna here just to deepen this color. And then I'll go back and apply this in just a few areas, mostly over some of my mid-tones. And this will create the deeper colors and the shadows on the flower die cuts. Remember that the panel will dry lighter than it looks while you're painting, so I'm going to go back over my dark areas while the paint is still wet to make sure that those are a really nice deep color. And as I'm applying the paint, I'm always making sure I'm preserving the three shades, the light, the medium, and dark spaces on my panel. Remember, as long as your panel is still wet, these will blend really nicely. I've put that red panel off to dry, and I'm going to start on the green panel for the leaves and stems. So I'm mixing up a green paint. I'm using Viridian Hue, a bit of Cobalt Blue, and a touch of Yellow Ochre. I'll pull a bit of this onto another space on my palette so I can add lots of water to create a base color. I'm following the same process as in the red panel. I will wet my watercolor paper, and then I can start to apply the base color for this panel. I'll also need some areas that look more like stems. So after I have applied several tones of green paint, I'm going to add a little bit of burnt umber to my green mixture to create a brown-green shade that I can drop in on the panel. This will create some nice contrast not only in the stems but also in areas of the leaves. Once I have some nice contrast on my panel, I'll set this aside to dry, and I am ready to move on. I have an arched window embellishment here. This is from Tim Holtz Ideology, and it's from the baseboards and window frames collection. It's a nice heavyweight chipboard embellishment. There are lots of styles to choose from in this collection. I have this on a paper towel and I have some Ranger Distress Collage medium. It's the crazing version, and I'm going to apply this to the window frame with a collage brush. If you don't have a collage brush, just use your finger. I've done that many times. I'm going to apply a liberal amount. I'm looking for a fairly dramatic crazing effect when I apply the paint. So I will apply this to the entire surface of the arched window, and then I will give it some time to dry thoroughly before the next step. My window frame is dry. I am using Distress Oxide Spray in Antique Linen, and I'll spray this fairly liberally in my spray box. I'm going to allow this to dry, and then I'm going to spray it once more for really good coverage. The oxide spray flows into the crazed area and it creates some really nice color contrast. I have Distress Oxide Spray in Victorian Velvet, and while I have my spray box out, I'm going to go ahead and create a panel for some of the flowers. I'm just using a scrap piece of heavyweight white paper, and I've sprayed it very lightly. My watercolor panels are dry and I'm ready to start some die cutting. I have the Spellbinders Be Bold Blooms die set. This is a really great die set with lots of layering and different types of flowers. It's perfect for this technique. I'm going to arrange these dies on my red and green panels, and I'm looking for areas with nice contrast that also fit well with the shape of the die. So I'm selecting areas that will give the best watercolor effect to those particular die cuts. So for example, for the larger flower dies, I'm selecting areas that have a darker center and lighter coloring toward the outside of the petals. For the 3-layered flower, I'm selecting areas that have a light, medium, and dark tone. You will find lots of amazing spaces on your panel. After I've taped down my dies, I will run this panel through my die cut machine, and then I can repeat this process for additional flowers. Here is my tray of watercolor die cut flowers. I love the contrast on these flowers. The light, the medium, and the dark give so much dimension, and it really helps to pop those flowers on the surface of your card. So next I'll start on the green panel. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I am just going to line up the dies in areas that give the leaves and stems a lot of color contrast and dimension. I'm also going to go ahead and die cut the flowers from the panel that I sprayed with the Victorian Velvet Distress Oxide Spray. This is the die with the 5 teardrop shaped buds, and I'm adding this one just to give a bit more contrast with the other flowers, and also just to give a little nod to my favorite distress color. I have my card base here. It's an off-white A2 card base. I've scored this at 4 1/4, and I'm going to go ahead and fold and press this. I'm using Distress ink in tea dye and a small script stamp on a stamp block to create a bit of a background behind my window. The tea dye picks up a little bit of the burnt umber in the leaves and it pulls everything together. So I'm just using a pencil to mark the inside edges of the window arch, and then I will stamp off most of the ink onto a scrap piece of paper before I stamp onto my card base. I'm just going to stamp this several times inside the arch of the window. I'm going to start assembling my flowers and leaves and stems. I'm going to speed this up just a little bit, but I'll give you something nice to listen to. I have my flowers assembled and I'm going to start to adhere these to my arched window. I'm going to do this before I place the arched window onto the card front. This will give me access to both the front and the back of the window, so I can glue some pieces on from the front, some pieces on from the back. And once I have all of these adhered, I can go ahead and put it onto the card base. I decided to go with sort of a window box configuration for the placement of my flowers on the window. It also looks really nice when the flowers are placed at the top and they're sort of draping down over the top of the window. It's really fun to get creative with the placement of elements on your cards. Okay, I've finished adhering all of my flowers to the window frame, and I'm going to adhere the window frame to the front of my card base, and I'm just centering those stamps, that script stamp, inside the window. And I'll place some acrylic blocks on here to give this a little bit of time to dry really thoroughly. Next step is to create a greeting. I am using the Simon Says Stamp Brushed Flowers Stamp and Die set. It's a really nice set. I love how many dies come with this set. I think I've used this in one or two previous cards. I'm using the Sending Hugs greeting and the Small and Lots of Love sentiment strip. I'm going to stamp these in my MISTI. I'm starting with the Sending Hugs greeting. I'm going to stamp this in Distress Oxide Victorian Velvet. And I'm using a technique that I use a lot with my cards. I am going to stamp this with a Distress Oxide color or an ink color. And then once this is dry, I will go back over this with Versamark ink and a clear embossing powder. So this just gives the greeting a little bit of a pop, a little bit more added interest on the front of your card. And this is a great technique to use when you want to have an embossed look to your greeting, but you don't necessarily have the exact color that you need of embossing powder in order to make that happen. So I've finished stamping this. I will apply Sizzix Clear Embossing Powder. Again, it's my favorite embossing powder. I think I use this on nearly every card in some fashion, and I really love this technique for creating greetings that just have a little bit more interest, but maybe you don't have the color of embossing powder that you need to do that in one step. So here is my greeting. There is a matching die, but I am going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment strip first. This is the "And Lots of Love," and I will stamp this in the Victorian Velvet again. The color will be a little bit different between the two. I like that contrast. That doesn't bother me. I think it just adds more visual interest to the card. So once I finish stamping this, I can then run this through my die cut machine one time to cut both of these. I am using the matching die for the Sending Hugs. For the sentiment strip, I'm using Gina K's sentiment strips. I love this set. Look at all of the different sizes of sentiment strips you have here. So I will go ahead and line up my die. I'll get both of these taped down and run this through my die cut machine. I am going to cut this once, and then I'll cut 2 additional of each of these shapes just to stack these, adhere them together, and give a little bit more dimension to my greeting and my sentiment. Okay, last step is to adhere these to the front of my card. I'm just lining everything up here, making sure that I have visual balance on the front of my card. So I'll place these over on the upper right-hand corner. I'm going to adhere these with some very strong liquid adhesive, but I also need to match the height of the window frame. So I'm going to add 2 layers of foam squares to the back of each of these pieces to match the height of the frame. This will also add a little extra stability to these die cut pieces. I created this card for my sister who had a very difficult 2022 and just had a very big surgery. This would also make a really nice sympathy card as well. So here's the completed card. I really love the simplicity of this card, and I love how these watercolor flowers came out. Here is another card that I made. This one is using an acrylic base. The instructions for this card are up on my blog at prettypaperblackbirds.com. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope this inspires you to pull out that watercolor set and create some really beautiful panels. Thank you so much for watching.